So first, welcome everyone, and I'd like to ask Dr. Phil Joyce, the Executive Dean of the School of Public Policy, to say a few words to inaugurate our session.
Thank you, David. Good afternoon. As David said, I'm Phil Joyce, Senior Associate Dean of the School of Public Policy, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the three webinars we're conducting over the next 3 weeks on safe, fair, and accessible voting in advance of the November 3rd election. This is an outgrowth of a collaboration among Big Ten public policy deans and is being hosted, as you can see, by the University of Maryland School of Public Policy. Again, this is the first of 3 sessions. Today, we're going to focus on safe voting on October 12th, which is 1 week from today. The focus will be on the fairness of the voting process, and on October 19th, on ensuring access to the franchise. Just a reminder to all of our attendees that today's webinar is being recorded. And so I will now, without further ado, turn it over to Professor David Mussington of our own University of Maryland School of Public Policy. David, take it away.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you all of you for participating on our panel. So thank you to Dr. Benenson and to Dr. Bauer, and hopefully our third colleague, Dr. Sprinkle, will join us shortly. The overall motivation of this panel has sort of 2 or 3 different elements. First, as a School of Public Policy, we're interested in elections, obviously in election administration, but we're also interested in risk management. And I should say, during my school, I'm actually a risk manager, but a cyber policy risk manager rather than a public health risk manager. So going into this calendar year, it was my expectation that cyber risks were going to be what we were most concerned with. Well, of course, we all know what happened, or what has happened. Cyber risks have receded up until relatively recently, and the SARS-CoV-2 virus has upended not only society and our economy, but our election process as well, both through the primary system and more recently, participation in our elections has become subject to the same sort of risk communication, the risk calculations as so many other areas of social life. So encouraging safe and transparently trustworthy voting is something that democracies have to do. Our democracy in particular requires that the public understand the risks that they confront. And as a public policy school and as a Big Ten community, we're interested in encouraging the maximum knowledge and awareness of the public and the maximum access to expertise on those topics. And that's why I'm so pleased to have Dr. Jody Benson, Dr. Cynthia Bauer, and soon Dr. Rob Sprinkle on our panel to discuss these issues. With that introduction, I wonder if I could ask Dr. Bauer and Dr. Benenson to introduce themselves, and we'll move on from there. So Dr. Bauer first, please.
Sure. Hello, I'm Cynthia Bauer. I'm the director of the Center for Health Literacy in our School of Public Health here at the University of Maryland College Park. I've been here almost 4 years, and prior to that spent about 20 years in the federal government, first at the Federal Department of Health and Human Services, and then 10 years at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta. So happy to be here.
Thank you. And Dr. Benenson?
Good morning. My name is Jody Benenson. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Public Administration at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. I'm thrilled to be here today. My background is primarily in the areas of civic engagement and how it relates to public policies and efforts of nonprofit organizations. And so I've also spent some time working at Tufts University's Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, as well as their Institute for Democracy and Higher Education. And so most of my background around civic engagement revolves around the relationship between efforts surrounding voting and other civic and political activities and young people. So I'm really glad to be here today.
Oh, thank you both. I think that you both of your participation on the panel gets us into the space where we need to be, which is how to let people understand the risks that we all confront and the impact that can have on our electoral participation. It's not as if the risk messaging that we get in the public sphere is necessarily transparent or equally understandable, and that's what our panel is going to try and do today. While Dr. Sprinkle tries to connect, I am going to try and become an epidemiologist and MD for a few seconds. Apologies in advance for the inevitable mistakes. So first, what I'd like to do is sort of canvass your awareness of the public health issues in play here, and sort of leveraging from some of the materials that we've exchanged prior to our panel, just to get your impressions of the relative risk of in-person voting versus the other methods that we have, either advanced vote or mail-in voting, and what you think the communities that you know best think about those risks. How do they think about those? So first to you, Jody.
So in terms of the in-person voting versus the...
How do you think that people who are engaged civically think about it?
Yeah, it's been interesting having conversations with people, especially here. I live in Douglas County, in Nebraska, and I particularly speak to a lot of the conversations happening here about a range of different messages. People are receiving about in-person voting versus voting distance voting. I'm still waiting for my ballot to come in the mail, and I think the messages that we're receiving broadly vary depending on there are some partisan efforts happening, but in the terms of the broader policies, I think that we're seeing there's no particular mandates right around whether or not one should be voting in person or I guess voting by mail or absentee, depending on the variations across different states and the terms that are used. But I think the ultimate goal is to ensure that people have, opportunities to vote in ways that are the most comfortable with that for them. And especially on our college campus, we're trying to make sure as well that young people have information about the different places that they need to be voting. But I think one of the challenges that we're facing specifically is around how states across the country are have different levels of resources. I'll talk about this a little later. I know, David, you mentioned that we're going to be talking about this a little later, but just the variation in messaging and implementation by different groups, especially nonprofit organizations and as well as political organizations, I think is going to influence over the next 29 days the ways we see engagement. So I can talk more about that later, but I think it really depends. Messages are varying. The ways people are feeling about engagement, whether in person or voting by mail, just truly are varying by locale, by information received. And I'll go more in depth a little later about some of the implementation efforts, I guess, that we're seeing across the country.
Okay, thank you. Cynthia? What comments might
Sure.
you?
And I saw that Dr. Sprinkle did join us, so he may have
Yes.
some other things to say about the actual, physical safety measures. But I think there's sort of two tracks we're working on in parallel. There's the psychological safety, and then there's the physical safety. And so we know that from a psychological perspective, people are feeling pretty unsafe, right? So the New York Times app right now has a headline that says voters feel like it's going to be hell no matter what happens with the election, right? And it quotes a number of people in the article talking about just, the level of fear and anxiety. So what we know is that there was fear and anxiety already about what was going to happen with the election. COVID got layered on that with more fear and anxiety. And then now with all of the rhetoric that's been happening over the last few months, there's more fear and anxiety layered on top of that. And we know that fear and anxiety short circuit cognitive processing, right? They interfere with our ability to kind of think more deeply about issues. So I think the first thing is to recognize there's the physical and psychological components operating simultaneously. And the second thing is to really take seriously the level of fear and anxiety that people have and think about all the ways that we need to prepare to try and address that fear and anxiety. So there's the fear and anxiety that we can do that will ensure physical safety. And then simultaneously, we need to think about addressing, like, whether that's the messages, whether that's providing, one of the things I think about is, voting is very ritualistic. People who've been voting a long time have always gone to the same place. Many of the same poll workers are there. I know when I lived in Atlanta, I voted at the neighborhood school. There were the same poll workers there election after election. we're now asking people to potentially do unfamiliar things in unfamiliar places. And so I think there's this level of safety that we need to provide in terms of, is there anything familiar, for example, that we could put in the space that would help people feel more comfortable? Maybe is there anything about the places that we can still do anything about in terms of locations? I mean, so there's other things, there's the messaging for sure, but I would also think about other things that would help enhance people's sense of safety and familiarity, because all of those things have been disrupted right now. And I think everyone's just feeling very unsettled because every single thing related to how they used to vote is not the way that it used to be. And so I think trying to provide some anchors that will kind of reassure people, try and cultivate a little bit of safety in addition to the things we know about virus, protecting ourselves from the virus would be helpful.
Okay, Phil, I could actually ask you to hold that thought a little bit about those anchors, because that sounds like a theme that we perhaps should explore a little bit more deeply in a few minutes. But Rob, I've asked a question about people's awareness of where the communities they live, or they're familiar with, what kind of impressions or tonality people are detecting regarding the activity of voting. So we're going to start off, however, with a question that you can anticipate because you've seen it from me more than anyone else. Rob has tolerated my generalist questions more than anyone else. Rob, could you first introduce yourself and your background, just so that we can anchor ourselves in actual medical knowledge and public health expertise, in addition to Cynthia and Jody?
I'm trying to master my WebEx background as instructed, but it's not happening. Yeah. Anyway, could you? This is an odd way to start a response. Could you repeat the question, please?
Sure. First, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Oh yeah, Rob Sprinkle. I'm professor and the associate professor of public policy. I do have a public policy doctorate, but also I'm a physician, medical doctor, licensed, boarded, double boarded, etc. So I've been following, well, not following, living through the same thing we've all been living through, but also simultaneously as a policy scholar and as a physician. And I can tell you that I know more about COVID-19 than I do about any disease I've ever treated or ever had. I've just not had this one, and I've not treated it either. But it's an extraordinary amount of information. We're learning so much, and we're certainly learning that this is very dangerous, and that its danger is very often underestimated or simply dismissed.
In that context, we've heard from Cynthia and Jody that there's variation across different states in the level of public knowledge. There's probably shared fear, or at least uncertainty, regarding the safety of in-person voting. And so, which is a good intro to the first question I had to you, Rob, which is how I'd like to sort of begin this panel, which is, do you agree that in-person voting should be treated as a last resort, with risk guidance favoring other methods? Or
Yes.
is that too extreme a position?
No, it's not too extreme, and there are 5 states that do who do mail-in voting routinely, universally, and they don't do in-person voting. There's nothing wrong or unusual with remote voting. And at the moment, when we know that any congregation of people produces a surge in local infections, planning to congregate people is a surprise. It is asking for trouble, and because it is obviously asking for trouble, it's going to intimidate people who are unwilling to vote that way, who would prefer to vote differently. However, if those people are also being intimidated that they shouldn't vote that way, it produces a real problem. So what we've done is you and I, is create a list of recommendations that make good sense if in-person voting is going to occur. Our groups, and that should happen everywhere. That's our assumption. If in-person voting is going to be part of that, then special precautions must be taken. And communicating those precautions to the people who have to take them, both administrators in localities and volunteers at the polling places and voters, is a real challenge. And that's why I'd like to hear what our other panelists have to say about that.
Cynthia, you talked about portals or gateways to risk message or communicate to different communities in perhaps different ways. Could you expand on that, please?
Well, I've said to in several venues and to several colleagues now, I think the adjective I've heard people use most repeatedly since the pandemic started was confused. And that's confusion is happening in the context of the World Health Organization declaring an infodemic, and an infodemic being characterized by an overabundance of information, but it's information that's misleading or intentionally or not, as well as rumors and other things. So I think we're in a very unusual space. This is not a deficit of information overall. It's a deficit of information that gives people confidence that they understand what's going on and that they can take actions that keep themselves and their family and their community safe. And so it's a very weird space because risk communication is premised on the fact that risk communication done well provides people that confidence to take those actions. So the other challenging thing that's kind of violating a lot of communication fundamentals is one of our core principles is always rely on trusted sources. But right now, many trusted sources are themselves the source of inaccurate or really damaging information. And so I think it is very tricky to find out who should be the messengers in this space. But once we do find those messengers, I think there should be a great deal of effort expended to try and make sure those trusted sources are themselves providing accurate information, whether that's community leaders, faith-based leaders, educational leaders, business leaders, whoever are the leaders at the community level, who are those trusted sources. I think really focusing on making sure they have accurate information and that people feel, oh, I can go to them and I can feel confident that if I'm going to do X, Y, Z, that's a good thing. Now that sounds easier. It's very challenging to do that in this current environment that we're in. But I think we have to recognize just saying rely on trusted sources is not the remedy at the moment, because we can't be confident that trusted sources in communities themselves have accurate information.
Jody, could you comment on, from your civic engagement perspective, how different communities might select those trusted sources, given that sources exist in other venues? Maybe some of those can be repurposed.
Absolutely. Cynthia, I've been thinking a lot about this as well, like especially this idea, this like infodemic idea that there's so much information going on around that, yeah, it can get so confusing. And there's different dates, for example, being presented around different parts of the election process. The like, for example, here in Nebraska, in thinking about the dates that we are encouraging people to submit their ballots, but that's not actually the deadline. So there are nonprofit organizations, for example, like the League of Women Voters, that are doing, really fantastic work in making sure that we are getting the kind of information, the nonpartisan information that we need. Yet there are aspirational deadlines, and then there are the actual deadlines. And I think that information can can be confusing to people, especially first-time voters, people who have never, we know that, I talk about voting like sometimes like I talk about like flossing, it's a ritual. I always appreciate that analogy. And yet we know that for many first-time voters, especially young people, especially people who might disproportionately be likely to turn out to vote, this like too much information can be really confusing, and we need to simplify it. And so I think some of the things that we've seen that are working well, especially thinking about who should be the messengers and who should be providing this information and who should be provided with information are people like our community leaders that represent communities themselves. So for example, we have organizations here in Nebraska that are working closely with individuals that live in predominantly Black neighborhoods and predominantly Latinx neighborhoods here in the state to make sure that we are seeing leadership that's reflective of historically, I guess, underrepresented and marginalized groups who have had barrier after barrier, due to significant policy changes around and voter suppression. Who have, I guess, been left out of the democratic engagement process. And so we're finding that, making sure that community leaders who are representative of neighborhoods and thinking about neighborhood association representation, nonprofit organization representation. And of course, like one of my, areas of interest is looking at young people, right? And so if we're thinking about trying to engage voters on our college campuses, making sure that there are young people engaged, not just in distributed information, but in creating that information too. It's about, I think, representation across the board, and just thinking about when we are trying to communicate some of those deadlines. We're coming up on these deadlines for registration and for submitting, ballots, because we are trying to encourage people to submit their early voting ballots as soon as possible, right? Recognizing some of the, I guess, the anxiety that was mentioned earlier and confusion around, the Postal Service, right? That has been infusing our narratives around democratic engagement. But as Rob mentioned, we've been voting by mail for a really long time, and it's worked pretty well. And we've actually seen, in spaces where early voting and vote by mail happens, we see higher turnout, especially among some of the population groups that I was mentioning earlier. So I think it's about inclusion in messaging and inclusion in deployment of those messages too, but not to forget that accuracy matters more than anything.
Just on that score, that sounds like a sort of a set of channels for potential public health messaging that might help pierce through the fog of confusion, I suppose, that we've heard about. Do you see many efforts to use those channels to communicate COVID-19 information, even wear your mask, socially distance, etc.?
I was going to say, I don't know how many people here use the social platform called Nextdoor, right? Which is for people who, for different neighborhoods, you join based on your address and zip code. But our counties here have started using that before the pandemic and have been using it pretty repeatedly to get out information. There's a lot of like neighborhood association leaders who are on that platform. So I sort of, in addition to my university affiliation, I am also a member and leader in my local civic association, and so have some interaction that way. And I think, that is one of the sort of hallmarks of American democracy, is sort of all of these this network of civic associations that we have here. And I do think that they could be much better purposed in terms of getting out information. Our civic association, we have a listserv. I'm the communication manager of that listserv, so I am sharing information. Our local officials have been willing to get on Zooms with us and hold discussions about these things. So I think that there are sources available to us, but maybe we haven't had to do them before. So that goes back to like all of this newness that we're dealing with. So while some states may be very used to doing mail-in voting, the reality is most of us haven't. Most of us are used to showing up and doing it in person. Even if it's early voting, we've still gone to a place and done it. And so I think that's the other thing, is that we're trying to normalize something that has not been normal for a lot of people. It may become normal over time, but right now it's still a new thing. And I think we have to do some work again around making people feel comfortable, because that's the thing I hear most routinely from at the neighborhood level, is people are fearful that if they mail in their ballot, the postal service is going to not deliver it in time, or it's not going to be counted, or somehow it's not going to make it where it's supposed to. So I don't, in Maryland anyway, I'm not hearing a lot of confidence in mail-in voting. So I think we just have to be mindful of that we should not take for granted that people see all of these alternatives as equally good.
Rob?
Yeah, I have a question for our other panelists, and that is, how would one communicate publicly about the risks to particular people if they volunteer to work at a poll? These are well-founded risks, but they relate to personal health, personal characteristics, gender, and that's rather touchy, particularly on a large scale. And also along that line, there's a differentiation that we've discussed between personal risk and civic risk. And while it may be the case that a volunteer could willingly accept personal risk, he or she is also then put in a position of increasing or trying to minimize civic risk. If you were a coronavirus virion, an individual virus, and if you had preferences that you could imagine, your preference, if you wished to propagate, would be to infect a young, healthy person. Those people are not likely to die. They're very likely to have few, if any, symptoms, but they're most likely to spread the virus to other age groups and other parts of society. So they are the prime vectors who are also the prime candidates for volunteer work. And among them are people with special vulnerabilities of which they may not be aware. So that's pretty tricky. And not only would you have to communicate this to the potential volunteers, but also to the officials in localities who might have a very difficult time understanding these concepts.
I was gonna say, Jody, that's Jody's demographic that she works on, so I'm sure she has a lot to say about that. But I would just say, I would not go after the non-mask wearing, hard partying, let's hang out in groups of, 500 to be my poll workers, right? But we have seen that there are a lot of young people who are extremely interested and engaged in this election. This is not an election in which they see themselves as, sort of uninterested. I'm not saying 100% of the demographic, and Jody can certainly say more about that. But I went out to one of the protests in DC, and I was on the street wearing my mask with my 20-something-year-old daughter, and there were lots of mask-wearing protesters around too. So there are a lot of people in that demographic who are very engaged in these issues, and I think they will be the people who will understand the necessary reasons for taking those precautions and how to do it, and they will care about being there. So I'm sure Jody has much more to say about that, though.
Yeah, I used to consider myself young, and then I recently learned I'm very much out of the demographics. So I will do my best based on the research that I know. But like, it's an interesting question because yeah, like Cynthia mentioned, we know young people like are like seizing power, trying to seize power right now. We've seen through a lot of the protests, as you mentioned, Cynthia, that young people not only have been showing up, right, for other types of political events, but also that we've seen very, like, at least very little evidence of kind of the spread of the virus from some of the larger, I guess, events where young people are masked and kind of complying with some of the guidance that has been received through health organizations and agencies. And but like, just because we're seeing young people turn out for these kinds of political demonstrations, there still exists a lot of confusion about kind of, I'm just even thinking about the intersection between that kind of some of the requirements that come from with voting. There's still a lot of like research, like kind of some recent research and polling that's been done with young people, is that they still aren't quite sure. Like a third of young people most recently said that they actually don't know whether or not they could register to vote online in their state. So some of those, like, while the political I guess momentum is really high, some of the nuts and bolts around, like, and perhaps like there's a great recognition of some of that kind of physical protection that's needed, some of that civic risk, or perhaps even just thinking about and thinking about how we might define civic risk broadly, lack of knowledge and information, thinking about kind of this idea of civic literacy, about kind of the basics around voter registration and engagement is still new to young people. It can be, I think, easier sometimes to, or not maybe easier, but just different in terms of engaging around events like, politically, that might require, I guess, less planning. And than it is to plan around voting and things like that. But I agree that young people are highly engaged. We're seeing young people but we use young people engaged in some ways, but we also can't generalize and think about young people as a monolith as well. And so we need to be careful about thinking about the fact that there are, it just like research shows that young people, for instance, who are in college are engaging differently in ways that young people who are not, in college, and especially in terms of their knowledge about civic issues, about voting in particular, about trends when it comes to voting in the past. But this election is like no other, and I even think about too in the way that we have, I guess, seen young people being contacted differently right now about issues of voting, since, we're talking about voting right now, and young people kind of, I don't know, engaging differently, perhaps based on just the information they're receiving. And I think Nextdoor is a great app. I've been thinking a lot about that. And we're also seeing young people engage in like using a lot of different tools like TikTok, right, to get the word out about different types of political events happening. I don't have TikTok. I've heard it's pretty great. Instagram, Facebook, all these different things. But we also know, again, that there are those like cybersecurity issues, I think, that David, you mentioned earlier, that, I don't know, overlay some of these other issues too. I'll stop talking now, but I'm just thinking, basically, like, my message, is that young people aren't a monolith, and we need to be having multiple different types of messages, but the momentum is there. And we need to make sure we capture that, not just in 2020, but also as we move into some of these more local elections too, in 21, 22, like making sure that we're continuing these kind of messaging and engagement, because I have a feeling that some of these mechanisms that we're going to be using, and as we kind of head toward November, are going to continue to be needed in the coming months and years as we head into more municipal and midterm elections in 22 as well.
I'm just trying to draw some threads on that. I think that what everyone's just said shows how many different outlets there are for communication. Some of which are going to be used for risk communication, even if it's inaccurate risk representations that are in there. So you have messaging irrespective of whether someone who who wants to be a trusted source of information is present or not. Would any of you have a comment on the following position? That is, one of the reasons why we have such levels of public confusion on COVID-19 risk guidance is because our more authoritative spokespeople or sources aren't good at using the preferred channels of information consumption that the public uses, because there is an apparent deficit between, for example, CDC guidance on mask wearing and social distance, and the behavior of large portions of the public. Overlaying that onto elections gives you a specific filter on what we're likely to see for in-person voting. So is it that those who need to message don't understand how it works, or they've chosen older, less effective means to communicate what they want to communicate, or they're just being drowned out by other messages?
I think it's the drown out problem, because I think if you look at social media, so the social media platforms in particular, they are built to make information shareable, right? That's what they do. And so the kinds of, the research shows that the kind of information that's more likely to be shared is highly emotional, oftentimes inaccurate, but it's not the stuff coming from the trusted sources for the most part. So for example, CDC was one of the federal agencies that was very early to social media. They've had a very active social media effort for quite some time now. And they are working across multiple platforms. And they've gotten very good at, for example, infographics and more visual forms of messaging. But the volume of other types of information is so huge. And I used to impress upon my former colleagues this, even in Atlanta, the assumption was if you went around and said you worked at CDC, everybody knew what that meant. I would go in the grocery store and people, you'd talk to people and they'd say, where do you work? And I'd say CDC, and they'd say, what's that? And that's in Atlanta, the headquarters of CDC. So I think we just need to be mindful that, the things we assume everybody knows what the National Institutes of Health is, what the Food and Drug Administration is, what the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention is. People don't really know what they are, what they do, what their responsibilities are. They might have some, if you ask them in a survey, they might have some basic name or brand awareness of those agencies, but that's about as far as it goes. And so I think it's, for me, as a communication scholar, it's really the volume. The accurate information is so overwhelmed by the inaccurate information that circulates very freely and very rapidly through the social media platforms right now, that it's really hard to, kind of outweigh that.
Rob, before I continue, do you have what sort of conclusions would you draw from these portrayals of the information environment that people are in?
Well, several. One, in terms of if you come back to the volunteer issue, the communication would have to be discreet, and if ineffective at a general level, then it would have to be personal.
Okay.
So that's quite different. I mean, you really can't have volunteers who themselves have health problems volunteering, and that's awkward. It might be least awkward if the solicitation is general, which up front says that you need to be in good health. You cannot have the following conditions. Among them, though, say, would be if you're a male and you have a brother who was severely affected by COVID-19, do not volunteer for a reason having to do with genetics. But it's rare, but it's real. That sort of thing, one would envision some of that communication to happen after a volunteer presents himself or herself to serve. And so that would entail a degree of understanding in the officials administering an election site. And I just don't have any confidence in that. The other, it would be highly likely that volunteers would be disproportionately conscientious. But conscientious people may be conscientious about visiting their grandmothers in nursing homes, about going to church or synagogue every weekend. They might not realize that the chances of being in the same room with the coronavirus are very high. And if the personal protective equipment used is not used exactly as it should be, and these are people not accustomed to using it, then the chance of exposure is very high. So should they be told to quarantine themselves for 2 weeks? If they knew they would be told that, would they volunteer? Would they actually come for training that would include the use of PPE, the donning and the doffing, although that you've seen on television, but not to the extent that it's done in a clinical setting. But still, it's no joke, right? And would they be willing to wear that during training so that other trainees would not infect each other? Remember that this particular age group is the age group that is most likely to carry the virus. Not likely to be symptomatic, but most likely to carry it and to transmit it. So they are the prime vectors. And getting people to understand that so that they can minimize the civic risk that they then present is tough. Plus you have voting, early voting, you have voting on the day of. You'd have some people volunteering to manage the influx of mail-in ballots. So that would go on for days afterwards. This is logistically a big operation. And, there'd be fatigue, boredom, anxiety about repeated exposures. This is how it would play out, and these are important concerns. Some of this could be communicated to the public in general. Some could be communicated more specifically when enrollment as volunteers would occur. But there would have to be training and trainers continuing to be involved. This is pretty complicated stuff. I mean, you don't want voting to turn into another Sturgis motorcycle rally. And yet it would involve far more people than were at Sturgis.
Which opens a potential for a prediction. I won't ask you for a prediction because that's not fair. But before we go in that direction, could I ask Cynthia or Jody to shift the emphasis a little bit from voters and volunteers to election administrators? How aware do you think they are of these sorts of risks that Dr. Sprinkles just laid out? Who wants to go first?
I haven't really had any engagement with the election administrators. So I don't know that I could comment on that, but I will say that just generally, we know that there's a wide range of knowledge on any topic, and just based on this goes back to what I was saying earlier about direction. That directions are notoriously bad in lots of domains, right? Whether it comes to the directions we get in a consumer product that we bought, to directions that we get with, medical devices and prescription drugs and things like that. So directions are uniformly problematic in our society. They're usually not written from the perspective of somebody who is not familiar. They're written by people who are very familiar with a process, and they sit down and try and write directions for people who are not familiar with a process. And that is inevitably a bad idea. So I think what you need to do is really think through what Rob was saying, is like, what are all the different tasks that have to happen for voting to take place? And then what are the directions you're going to need for different groups of people to successfully execute those tasks? And then create directions from the perspective of the novice user, not the expert user, because the expert user already knows how to do these things. It's the novice user who needs to be trained to do these things, not just once, but repeatedly, right? And so that's the perspective. If I could offer one piece of advice to election administrators, was really focus in on the directions for all the different tasks. First of all, identify all the tasks, and then write plain language directions for all those tasks from the perspective of a novice user.
Yeah.
Jody?
Yeah, I'm just going to add, like, I was spending some time last week looking at some of the very specific instructions here in Douglas County, Nebraska, that have been provided to not just I'm thinking about, like, both, like, the election administrators, like the individuals that are going to be the poll workers in the space on November 3rd, but also how that is being communicated with the public too, so that the public also kind of knows how things are going to happen. Like, with the number one thing being, which is interesting, encouraging citizens to vote by mail, which was an interesting message, to convey externally, but making clear that, some of those specific things, Cynthia, that you just mentioned, to the public externally facing, that PPE is being provided to individuals before election day. And we can talk a little bit about that later if you'd like, in terms of how that is actually varying across the country. But also, like, little things like making sure that each voter is being given their own pen, to make sure that they're developing protocols and procedures for election workers and voters. But, like, what does that actually look like? Making sure that as a voter, I'm coming in with that information in advance, so I actually know how to navigate the system. I think this is, Cynthia, why you're kind of focus on those instructions are so important, because even myself, as a fairly informed voter, not really sure, like, what that's going to look like when I come in, can be kind of, can be really confusing. And so I think, yeah, some of, things like expanding cleaning and practicing social distancing, knowing that that's happening in the office, is good. But when it comes to, like, oh gosh, I didn't have a chance to, like, do that first thing that was recommended to me, perhaps by voting by mail in advance, and I didn't request my ballot, and I need to go in, like, what is that actually going to look like, and is going to increase, or I guess decrease, the likelihood of me showing up that day? Those instructions are going to be so important.
Well, and it's so easy for us to use video now. So, for example, we were dealing with this. I mean, in case any of you have gone to the doctor or the dentist or a hospital or anything in the last 8 months, you've noticed it's a very different experience, right? And so I was talking to a dental hygiene colleague of mine, and she was talking about the latest face mask they've been fitted for, and she looks like something from outer space with her new gear, because with the face mask, the shield, all the other PPE on, she's not recognizable as a person under all of that gear. And she said that people, they perceive that this communication that's so valuable with patients isn't just so difficult to happen. And I said, well, do your patients who are coming in even know what to expect? What have you told them before they even arrive? And I said, it would be very easy to make a very brief video, just walking them through here's what's going to happen. When you arrive at facility X, this is what it's going to look like. This is who's going to greet you. This is how you move through the space. This is, where you'll wait, blah, blah, blah. That gives people, it goes back to what I said at the beginning, is try and provide people some anchors, some sense of like, okay, I've been prepared. I can visualize what this is like. One of the core health literacy principles that we live and die by is make things as concrete as possible. You know, make either connect it to something they know, show them what it's going to happen, use those plain language techniques to really break it down and give them step by step. So there's a lot of things we know about effective communication that we could use to make everybody in the process, not just the voters, but the people working and the administrators and everybody else, the media, who are going to be, all over polling places, trying to interview people coming and going from the polls and covering what's going on. I mean, there's just so many audiences here that I think we just need to be mindful of the different, there's going to be some core information that everybody needs, but then really being mindful of what are those kind of very specific, concrete things that we can give to each group. Again, to enhance their readiness. That's what you want, right? In emergency response, you're always talking about like, are people ready to do what you want them to do? Have you given them the tools to do it? And then if things don't go as expected, do they know where to go to get some help? And I think that would be the other thing, is anticipating if things don't start to go well. Let's say at a polling place, things are starting to fall apart. Do people know what to do? Because what you want to do is not have that place descend into, a very, a high level of disorder, right? So I think also providing people, some things are going to fail. So we don't know exactly how many, where, but anticipate there will be some failure because there's humans involved. And then give people those, emergency cords, so to speak, about what to do when things start to not go as planned.
Just on that point, it's an interesting analogy with cyber risk, because after 2016, many universities, ours, Belfer Center, Harvard, et cetera, came up with playbooks, which were instruction manuals, plainly written, for election administrators and the public to explain how things worked and what to do if bad things happen. So it sounds like there's a sort of convergence of message quality, maybe, at least the aspiration for it in that way. So it resonates real closely with what both of you have said. That said, Rob, what's your opinion of that kind of messaging across the country? I mean, in our elections are our, perhaps it's not our election administrators, perhaps it's a level higher, our governors, our mayors, whatever, are they, what's the quality of messaging that you're seeing as a public health person?
I don't see any. I mean, I don't know. I just have no idea. It obviously varies place to place, even in states that have been very attuned to transmission risks. Otherwise, it's quite mixed. The states that have already been all mail-in states insist that it works great, and they have very high voter participation. So they're not changing anything. So they are pre-prepared.
Okay.
They don't have to go through nothing that we're discussing today is a problem for them.
So this is sort of an interesting quasi-experiment that we're running here.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. I mean, and the dependent variable would be, likelihood of a surge within 2 weeks of peak election day, peak election activity, with dummy variables for mail-in and non-mail-in voting, right? So you would expect that Utah would have no change in its infection rate, for instance, but that some other states really would. There's so many. I mean, David and I have been in discussions with a very well organized local official who is far out ahead as a leader in this area, and she's not optimistic at all, because she happens to be responsible for an unusual county in her state, a state in which what she's trying to accomplish is not even a goal, let alone a plan.
Jody, could you comment on the sort of variation issue between sort of states, localities across the country a little?
Well, it's interesting, Rob. I'm now thinking about, like, well, first of all, I'm trying to think about what we've learned after the primaries too, right? When it's come to some of the mail-in components, and also, I think one of the first places we saw, one of the first places kind of where there was a lot of like election buzz was around like Wisconsin, right? Yes. Just some of the legal challenges to the processes, and we can definitely talk more about that. And something I've been thinking a lot about too is just like what the conversations that are happening and trying to figure out the appropriate amount of PPE the states actually are going to need to safely implement the elections. And I've been spending some time thinking about, like, Utah, right, versus where I live, right here in Nebraska, where we just have a different culture around mail-in voting, but we're seeing some like excellent election administration, like at the level as well when it comes to messaging. And so, I think about the fact that because these elections are run at local and state levels, there's going to be considerable variation. By state to state when it comes to a lot of these administrative decisions and messaging, and I think about some of other states, like we saw like Indiana and Iowa, that actually deployed the National Guard when distributing supplies. But in other states like California, Delaware, Minnesota, it's my home state. I grew up in Minneapolis, and just kind of seeing other states kind of package some of the PPE with like kind of traditional election materials, right? So kind of like the deployment and implementation of these materials can actually serve as a signal too to prospective voters, especially as we're kind of talking about some of the more hard to reach groups or groups that have been historically marginalized. Like, what is the difference between somebody from your local community and then the National Guard kind of deploying different types of PPE materials? It's something that I think we've seen too, spilling over into some other political movements throughout different states. And also, so it's about kind of the disbursement of PPE we're talking about. And then the second thing I think we're talking about is how much each counties actually need. And so there's, I guess, a couple of different issues that I think we need to be thinking about as we are moving into some of these implementation phases. We're already in it. I mean, people are already turning out, voting early in certain states. And the amount that states are getting has to do with some of the what the Election Assistance Commission was providing based on some of the funding that states were getting from the CARES Act. And so it's all being distributed differently based on some of these specific state needs and decisions to implement as well. So it'll be interesting to see kind of how it actually turns out in practice. But the natural experiment that we have here is going to have severe implications, I think, for move forward with election administration moving forward.
Yeah, unfortunately, in public policy, we're not supposed to actually experiment on large groups like this without their permission. So unfortunately, we're executing one. I was thinking of a large state that I won't name, since we're not naming states today. It's a state that announced that it was closing the available of ballot drop boxes across the state, instead of one per county versus one per large population group. One wonders the implications of that for the issue that we're talking about. Probably not good would probably be the conclusion, but it apparently was not in the desiderata, in the decision-making criteria that led to that decision, which seemed to be motivated by a fear of fraud in voting rather than a fear of risk exposure to this specific situation. In terms of PPE, of course, we already have antecedent PPE shortages or maldistribution in the first place. So, we always try and avoid the sort of a pessimistic scenario here, but the variation that I'm hearing doesn't seem to correlate with positives, clarity of messaging at the local level, or or with public health interventions into voting. Rob, do you disagree with that assessment? Rob?
Right.
Okay.
No, it doesn't, right?
I was going to share a slide, but I think that given that we have apparently some people in the chat who have some questions, I think it's probably better to shift to that. So, Paul,
David, can I make one more observation?
please do.
Rob opened by saying that the sort of draft guidance that you and he had drafted was premised on the idea that everybody wants to maximize voting, but we already knew that was not true prior to COVID, right? We know there are plenty of groups that do not want to maximize voting.
Fair
And
point.
so I do think that it might be interesting to kind of game both of those scenarios, right? What does it look like if your premise were true, which I don't think it is, that people want to maximize voting, and what if you follow the opposite, is that there are groups actively working to suppress voting, and you're trying to message and reassure people in that environment, because I think that is the reality, and that is the far more challenging situation that we face.
Fair point. I think that we were actually describing our ethical position, which is that participation is generally a good in our democracy. But I take the point. Rob, anything to add before we get to questions?
Well, the advice we offered was premised on an assumption of goodwill and shared aims. We know that that is not a safe assumption politically. However, it was the necessary assumption for giving what was basically clinical advice. So we said that it's clear that the best approach is mail-in voting, but not all localities will choose mail-in, and not all citizens will prefer it. So in the case of in-person voting, especially with volunteering to relieve personally vulnerable people from their duties, what would you have to do to minimize the chance of bad outcomes? And we held ourselves to that discipline. And the reason I put that premise at the top of the page in italics in the center was to explain why we were not engaging that question. It's also possible that if one gives advice on the premise that everyone wants to encourage voting maximally everywhere, then it could be that assumption will invite self-examination. And that's why we did that.
That's our premise. we obviously concur on this. Jody or Cynthia, any comments before we go to some of the questions we've been accumulating? Okay, Paul, I believe that you are controlling those. If you have some questions for our panelists, please fire away.
Thank you, David, and thank you to the panelists for those excellent presentations, and thank you to all of our attendees for submitting questions. We received a number of questions from people upon registration, and quite a few of those questions are probably more relevant to our subsequent panels, so we're going to ask you to please attend those panels as well. So I think the types of questions related more to some of the other process issues are probably better for that. But let me start with one question that came from one of our registrants. I don't have a name for this one, but the question is, what are the best sources of publicly available information that can help us build a safe plan in which we can feel confident? i.e., what can I share with family and friends who might not be planning to vote because they feel it is unsafe and or their vote is not secure? So I would submit that to the entire panel.
So our guests, Cynthia and Jody, first, please.
Well, since as we've been talking about, all voting is local, I would start with the local official sources, because that's going to give you the best information about what they're doing, right? So I would say that's not always necessarily easy to find, right? So I would say, these local platforms that we've been talking about, like Nextdoor, or contacting, whatever your structure is, whether it's your township or your county council. That's where I've been seeing the information coming from here in Southern Maryland, is like our county council, our state representatives have been putting out a lot of voting information. And directing people to the official websites. And I would just continue to send people back to those official sources, because I think there's just so much opportunity for rumor and misinformation if you're relying on anything else. The problem, of course, is going to be is that may not be plain language information, and there still may be some translation that's required. But all of these places have staff that you can email them. They tend to be on social media. I know when I've posted questions on Nextdoor to local officials, I get a reply. So there are ways that you don't have to just like go to someone's website and try and read unintelligible information. You can get that information orally. And as I said, at least where I live, people have been using Zoom and other platforms to do Q&As, and you can always request that. I mean, that's what we've done when we've had a significant number of people interested in having a conversation, is we ask the staff to set up a Q&A with our elected officials to get online and answer those questions. And in fact, I just have something in my queue for my civic association to forward on that was a Q&A with our state representative from this area, talking about some voting issues. So I do think, yes, there's a little bit of a burden on voters to do that reaching out at this point, but I think it's going back to those official sources. And if it's not clear to you, if the information's too jargon filled or technical, asking them to explain it to you orally.
Jody?
Yes, and building on that, I think there are some very specific formal sources that I would recommend people turn to. First of all, here in the United States, we have an election assistance commission, right? And so I think what's really great is if you kind of go to their website, eac.gov, you can actually look at election day contact information by state, because all elections are run, as many of us know, by the Secretary of State offices at the state level. And so if we're thinking about some of those official sources, then sometimes the state level information will then provide information at the local level, where, as we've all been talking about, that is how the governments our elections are administered, by the local government. So just at the very basic level, recognizing that we do have a commission, at the federal level that does provide information about the state level, which then typically at the state level, Secretary of State offices, what's really kind of nice, and I'm happy to kind of share some links in the chat if that's helpful. You can do things like see if you're registered to vote and to make sure that you're kind of getting additional information, like some of the information that I shared earlier about some of the local elections that are happening. But of course, there are also so many civic and nonprofit groups, as Cynthia mentioned, as well. And one of the groups that I tend to turn to is through an organization called the State Voices Network. And the State Voices Network is a good example of an organization that they oftentimes, like many other types of organizations, have I guess, like kind of like the League of Women Voters, right? They have state chapters and then local chapters as well. And so they're all nonpartisan, nonprofit organizations that are providing information and resources as well. So I think one of the great things about the nonprofit sector is that it can sometimes augment and enhance where there might be some need for improvement among federal, state, and local governments. And so there's just some really great nonprofit voting related resources that there's actually an organization out there called Nonprofit Vote, right? So just thinking about the ways that some of the more local organizations are providing these resources as well in a way that hopefully might be tailored to your own specific organization. But I think, or not organization, your own locality or state. You can see where my brain is today thinking about organizations. And so I think that again, starting through like the Secretary of State offices, providing that information. Most states are providing information. If they're not, I think it's good to sometimes look at some of those more local, nonpartisan organizations that are going to be providing, because they're nonpartisan means they're providing information that is political in nature, but is not partisan. It does not reflect the opinions of specific parties. So that would probably be my recommendation. It's what I usually recommend to my friends and family as well.
If I can add to that, I do agree that local officials, certainly in my state, Virginia, I phoned my local registrar and they were very happy to explain to me what they were doing in terms of PPE, because I, like many voters, didn't put my ballot in the mail. I walked it into the registrar's office because I wanted to, and I got to drop it in the box inside the office because that's what I'm like. They were very happy to provide all the information I wanted. In fact, there's even a ballot tracking application that they have for those who have some concerns about whether their ballot's going to be counted as cast. So local governments are often very open to providing any information that is requested, and sometimes more information than is requested, to be honest. There are also national organizations like Verified Voting and the Election Verification Network and other associated bodies, the Democracy Fund, which funds research on democratic processes and participation. All of these places have web presences, and they tend to be good information hubs that point to the secretaries of state and to voluntary organizations across the country close to where you live. So if you can find one of those good sources, you'll soon get a directory of other good sources. That's often a good way to start. So Paul.
Yeah, so David, another question that came in from our registration process, more related to behavioral and psychological aspects of voting. How do we ensure public confidence in vote by mail, not only before the election, but after, since mailed-in votes might take several days to count, and the opposition might use this delay to spread fear, uncertainty, and doubt about the results?
Cynthia, could I ask you to respond to that first, given your expertise in risk communications and perhaps the behaviors that risk orientations promote?
Yeah, I think transparency was one of the principles that you and Rob had in your guidelines. And I would just like to kind of expand on that notion of transparency. This goes again back to this notion of as experts, we understand our own processes, right? Because we created them. And so they make sense to us, but they don't make sense to other people who did not create them and don't participate in them routinely. So I think part of the way that you build people's confidence is you sort of pull back that curtain and you show them exactly what we've been talking about here. How are you preparing the place? How are you handling the vote by mail? You know, as much this is, we've been talking about, there's sort of overwhelming information. There's overwhelming information about certain things, and there's a scarcity of information about lots of other things. And so what we're talking about is opening up that process and letting people see all of the preparations that are being made so that safe voting, safe in the broadest sense, right? Not just our physical safety, but our psychological safety and the safety of the franchise. All of those things are being taken care of, and this is what we're doing. And then if people say, well, I don't think that's enough, they at least have something to, go on, right? But right now, I think this is, again, one of our core health literacy principles is if the those with the knowledge about a topic or a process, if they are not forthcoming and they don't do a good job explaining it clearly and carefully, people fill in with what they know, right? Because of the way our brains work, because of the way cognitive demand works, and we're looking for those heuristics and psychological shortcuts to process information. If people can't understand what we're telling them, they revert back to what they know or what they can find more easily. And so I think the more that we are silent or don't provide sufficient or clear information on our processes, the more people will stay in this high anxiety state, or they will fill in with what they think is happening or what they saw on Facebook or whatever, what they got through their WhatsApp network. So I think that's the real danger here, is that if the election officials do not sufficiently recognize and respond to that demand for more clear, transparent information about the process, I think that just runs the risk of either keeping people's anxiety at a high level or making it even worse than it is now.
So a question that came in from the chat, and it was directed to David. For Professor Mussington, could you please share how Canada is handling voting procedures regarding COVID in comparison to the US generally?
Okay, my expertise on Canada is a bit spotty, but I'll try my best. The Canadian response to COVID-19 has been a bit different than ours. Should say, full disclosure, I originated from Canada a long time ago, now live and work here. Elections are a different beast in Canada. I think that first, Canadians vote more frequently. Voter turnout's higher. Elections are simple because you don't have initiatives at the provincial level very often, and when you do, it's a national crisis. So you don't have them very often. I think there's more trust in the way elections work in Canada because they're a national thing. They're run by the Canada Elections Agency. In terms of messaging, the agency controls risk messaging on voting. So there's a lot of differences, and I think that in a sense the US is sui generis when it comes to the variety of voting methods, the variety of jurisdictions involved, and the variety of issues that end up on the ballot for local, state, and national decision making. So we have sort of a denser political construct in terms of the number of decisions we make through elections. Unitary or confederal systems like Canada, like Australia, like the UK are just a sort of different enough that the lessons learned of transferring from there to here is less than you might think. I might add that Canadians trust their government more than we might trust some of our major institutions. So the trust deficit probably is a bigger problem for us than it is for them.
That question is from Mark Looney, and this question is from Chuck Moorfield to all attendees. With respect to the Democrats, I get a lot of email asking for money. I get 0 links to a YouTube video explaining the relatively simple matter of mail-in voting. They should be willing to provide a channel to at least the blue side of the communication question. Videos for the complex information Rob so carefully laid out would also be very important and could be communicated via the political parties. Do our panelists have any comments on that?
Yes, agree completely. Yes. I mean, I think, we have ample evidence that we are in a highly video saturated culture, right? Videos are really driving a lot of our public narratives these days. And people like to watch videos. They prefer that. I mean, podcasts being an alternative. But oral information, whether it's oral, audio or audio visual, it does create a level of accessibility that is not there with print information. And the reality is a lot of print goes on and on, even on a web page or a fact sheet or a report or something like that. So I think the questioner is absolutely right that audio is being underutilized as a way to explain a lot of these very complex situations.
I also absolutely agree. I think I was actually also thinking, Cynthia, about accessibility and just making sure that, like, especially like when I'm teaching, right, making sure there are multiple modes of ways for engagement with students. Same, we should be thinking about the same for our constituents and eligible voters, and just as many like consistent messages, I guess, in as many modes as possible is important. And I think it's a really important point too to think about, I'm thinking of long-term campaigning, right? Not just like campaigning in the short term, but thinking about like the long-term value you might be able to receive from a candidate as well. I guess the advantage of providing information about not only the requests for money, but also information about voting. I think I do receive some of that information from some candidates, and those definitely stand out more than others. And so I think just that this is not my area of expertise, but we also know that keeping messages as simple as possible, right, are important for I guess candidate engagement. But I absolutely agree and think that the multiple modes and accessible modes of information are great. I hope we can continue with that line of thought moving forward.
And we have data on that because the U.S. Department of Education does adult literacy surveys from time to time, about every 10 to 12 years or so. And, what we know is that people with weak literacy skills are attracted to oral forms of communication. So, if you have a highly educated, highly literate population, then written and print information, it's not that they would still necessarily choose that. They still might choose other forms, but it's not going to be quite as daunting. But if you have weak reading skills, you do not automatically seek out written information. And I think, we sort of forget that. We forget that in information we provide about voting and information about candidates, about the process, about the ballot itself, about directions. It's on and on, right? We unfortunately keep focusing on print information when we know it's challenging for a large segment of our society.
Just to quickly add on to that, is it a fair statement that our failures to know how to message effectively about all these issues make our messaging about safe and risk-managed elections harder to execute? Just because if we don't do it so well with other messages, and we're using those same methods to communicate this new information, it strikes me that that's an uphill battle. Is that a fair generalization?
Well, since this is an academic audience, this will probably be a familiar concept to a lot of people. It's the culture of knowledge effect. Once you know something, once you become an expert in something, you forget other people don't know what you know.
Right.
And so I think it goes back to what I was saying is that, experts write the rules of the process, they write the directions, they write the information about how to do things, and we forget other people don't know those same things and don't know how to do them. So I would say that this is no the situation is no different. I mean, if you go back and look at, I've done some presentations on, the early messaging that was happening in January and February around COVID. To go back and look at go back now and look at what we were saying in January and February really reflects that. It was a conversation among experts. It was like, nothing to see here. We're talking amongst ourselves, we'll let you know when there's something important to say, kind of thing. It was really just, it was very, very different. And then suddenly, like, March, we go head on, and it's like suddenly we're pushing out all these new behaviors and all of these recommendations and everything. We did nothing to prime people, right? We just went headlong from state A to state B, and there was no lead up to that. And I think it's just, we do that repeatedly. And I think it's in part because we assume we created a message, we put it out there, of course, people will understand. And, the communication experts among the audience or who might listen to this in the future, they know that's not how communication works.
So, David, we have one more question from the chat that's really relevant also, I think, perhaps to a discussion about next steps and sort of the panel producing a set of principles. So I'll go ahead and read that. And you might want to have some discussion around that, or some discussion of expectations for reporting out something. And then if there's time left over, we can get to some additional questions that came in from the questions when people registered. So the question is from Mark Looney to all attendees, but actually he does say it's for Dr. Sprinkle and Professor Mussington in particular. Early in the seminar today, there was mention that Dr. Sprinkle and Professor Mussington wrote safe election procedure guidelines. Can those guidelines be shared?
Yeah, sure.
Rob, go ahead. I mean, I'm sort of the one who wrote the version 1.0 of a version 8.0 document, then corrected by you. So it's better now than it used to be. But what do you think, Rob?
Well, yeah, I don't see why not. I mean, if anybody who wants a copy, send me an email. I'll be glad to send one out. As for broader dissemination, yeah, that's fine with me too. I'm not sure anybody'd be listening, but.
Can I ask Cynthia and Jody just to comment, since you guys have seen it, and not many other people have seen the newest version? Does it suffer from what Cynthia mentioned, or is it a good baseline for other messages to be generated that might be more consumable by people less who don't talk like academics like us?
You go first, Jody?
Okay, I'll go first.
Any criticism's fair.
Well, no, something I mentioned this earlier. I actually wrote a note down. This idea of civic risk, right, and what that actually means, and the implications of that term. Any, personal risk. I think we're talking a lot about right now in thinking about some of the messaging, that Cynthia in particular has mentioned. But I think about the concept of civic risk, and I'd be curious about, as kind of you shared this document out, how that actually might be conceptualized and operationalized, especially thinking about the varying levels of just broader civic literacy, even using the term civic literacy, right? We might not necessarily all be on the same page about what we mean by that in certain contexts. And so putting, as somebody who also loves to put civic before different terms, the term civic, like thinking about like what that actually means, what that might actually communicate to people who might be operationalizing this concept, particularly in election settings.
Right. Well, I made it up.
And I supported it because it sounded good.
It seemed to fit, but since this was a civic event,
yes,
just permeated with civicness, then that seemed to be the right way to express it. And also there had to be a distinction between personal risk and, well, let me start this over. Let's take this out of the voting context, just in the regular public health context. Many people refuse to alter their behavior because they are willing to accept personal risk. And they do not really think of themselves as vectors, ever. They think of the personal risk as entirely absorbing all risk relative to their own infection. But that's just not the case. And anybody who gets infected becomes a vector. And if you, in the context, well, one other thing to say about this, we have seen in government officials and in public health officials very too little emphasis on the responsibility not to become infected. Not the desirability of not becoming infected, but the responsibility not to become infected because of the consequence that has on society as a whole. So if people, out of the best of intentions, enter into an activity that increases their chance of becoming vectors, and if they're doing it in a civic context, then civic risks seem to be a reasonable way to express it. And I knew David would like the term.
I really, not only for its applicability when thinking about the COVID-19 context or in thinking about elections, but in thinking, I appreciated your explanation around kind of just like the broader idea surrounding civic responsibility, right? Which we really kind of think about in terms of like active participation in public life and the community, and thinking about like being informed and committed and being constructed, right? And so I think I'd be very interested in kind of unpacking that further and thinking about how it might be applicable to other contexts as well. So yeah, thank you for just providing some background on that. And I think coining terms can be fun, and then operationalizing them can be like a equal challenge.
I run my own mint where I coin them, right?
The civic mint.
Can I sort of add to that? I mean, I appreciate your comments and the link between civic risk and individual risk and that notion of a vector, because in cyber policy, we talk about vectors all the time. We misuse the term, and I have Rob here to correct me all the time, which is useful. The notion of civic also, for me, connotes the possibility of disparate impact that needs to be taken on board by many people who act as if societies are completely homogeneous and where we don't have any equity challenges.
Right.
Because civic risk, it strikes me, is both civic risk is both a characteristic of society and unevenly distributed in a sense, because there are power relations here which call upon some to do things that others may not need or be able to do. And that is consistent with, I know, Paul's leadership in the Civic Center at SPP, the notion of engagement and mutual responsibility and accountability is something that perhaps we need a bit more of, generally speaking, sort of as an ethical position. So that's why it was attractive to me. I also think it summarized so much in terms of the dichotomy between individual claims of freedom and liberty on the one hand and responsibility of society on another, that I think COVID-19 really highlights a great deal.
So David, we've got about 20 more minutes, and we have a couple questions that are a little further afield from our subject, but I think they're certainly worth asking. But I don't know how you want to handle the the summary and wrap up of this?
I guess I'd like to give a little bit more time to the Q&A. People have signed up and they've listened to us for a while, so it's fair game for us to sort of hear from them.
Okay. Again, this is a question from the registration, so I think it's probably more related to your expertise, David, and maybe covered in our next panel, but here goes. Can any of the panelists envision a world in which secure online voting might be possible? How would the panelists compare the security of online voting to the security of voting by mail or even in person?
Well, my answer will be quick and to the point, as you can imagine. I don't think that online voting is safe now, and I don't think in the foreseeable future it's going to be either, in terms of integrity, in terms of secrecy of the ballot, or in terms of the equal availability of voting methods to voters. I think that the mythology around current online voting proposals is actually threatens to undermine more trustworthy and proven trustworthy in-person and by mail voting. So my answer is fairly stark. I invite panelists to comment.
David, don't you distinguish between online voting as usually imagined and voting through a secure cloud network?
Well, I think the question was about opportunities to vote that exist.
Okay.
In principle, I think that you could architect a cloud adjacent, by cloud I mean networks of computers distant, with all those characteristics that clouds have. In principle, I think that's an interesting direction to go in, but we don't live in principle, we live right now. And right now there is not an online secure system of voting that's in any way approximates what we can do through mail and through advanced vote and through in person. I wish if there was, we might have a different panel today, but unfortunately we don't. So, anyone else on the panel?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this too, especially as we're trying to think about, like what make elections different, right? Than like all the other different types of things that we do online, right? I right now, lately have been like banking through my phone, right? I'm trying to like minimize increase social distancing, not go to the bank. So it's pretty easy to like deposit checks. I'm shopping online right now, but I think one thing that is different and unique about elections compared to some of those other things is that number one, they are irreversible. So if I get a pair of shoes, don't totally love them online, I can actually return them, right? But number two, like elections are also anonymous. Unlike, if I am, taking a photo of like a check that I receive in the mail, right? So I think like right now, like we do not kind of, David, to your point, have secure, or many would argue, especially like we did see a couple of states this past summer, I think, attempt online engagement. But like I remember MIT came out with and Michigan as well, Big Ten shout out, but thinking about the fact that like the technology that these states were using actually did represent a severe risk to election security, right? And so I look forward to tuning in for that panel, because I think there'll be some interesting conversations that might emerge, and thinking about just the potential for the kind of, technology attacks that we've seen, internet attacks and in that realm. So just wanted to make sure to throw that out there too.
Well, that's a great prompt to our next panel, which will be entirely on that topic, with some nationally known experts that can tell you all the ways that adversaries might want to mess with American electors. But anyway, Cynthia, any comments?
No, just kind of back to one of the previous issues, though. It's just have to think about dropping communitarian messages into a non-communitarian context. So, one of the first questions that, I ask people if they're, when they're asking about messaging advice, I'm like, if you're going with a communitarian message, meaning like that you have some civic responsibility, do you already have that culture in place where that message is going to resonate? If you don't have a communitarian culture and you're dropping a communitarian message into a non-communitarian cultural context, it's probably not going to work so well as a message. So that's just one thing to kind of think about.
Fair point. Fair point.
Well, we do live in an era in which selfish and proud of it is an ascendant and unashamed idea. So yes, this would be an inauspicious time to try to make that change. On the other hand, if one is not satisfied with living in a selfish and proud of it society, then a beginning has to happen. You know, there has to be a pushback.
No, I agree. I think it's the question of when do you try that? I think when you are in a high stakes situation, which is what I think a lot of people have deemed the 2020 national election as a high stakes situation, I would not, bet the farm, as they say, on a on a strategy that is also high risk. I would say post-election, I'd be more than happy to contribute to the building of a communitarian culture. I just think going into the election with a communitarian message in a non-communitarian context is a bit risky.
I'd agree with that, and I'd also say that with 29 days to go until the 3rd of November, we're not exactly going well, we're not in a position to do that either.
I mean, so just to kind of one more point about that. I mean, we already know there are places where that's going to work, like sports teams, right? Sports teams have a culture of communitarian, of like looking out for each other, of having some sense of like we are in this together. There's certain, like civic associations, right, that already have that sort of sense. You can use those kinds of messages there because that sense of responsibility is, there's already some seeds there to build from. I'm just saying when you don't have that, I mean, what we've seen is that there's segments of our society that the communitarian approach makes sense, and there are segments where it clearly does not. So as a general strategy, then I would not use that. If I could segment that out and just send the communitarian message to the communitarians and the other messages to the non-communitarians, I would do that. But yes, as a rule, I'm going to come down in favor of communitarianism because I think having a sense of shared responsibility is generally a good idea.
Well, on that great note, I'd like to just share my screen for a second. Everyone's read the principles who is on the panel, but some of the people who are still connected to us haven't. So I'd like to put them up for a second if that works for people, just for people to look at. And I think that as a point of departure for discussing what kind of principles for safe in-person voting this cycle, they're not a bad set, and there are 5 of them, and so I'll just see if this works. It worked when we were trying beforehand, so let's see if it works now. I hope everyone can see my screen.
We can. It's a little small, but
Or
you expand.
Try again. Is that better?
No.
Probably better.
There's a zoom in. We all have that, but then it goes off the screen.
Is that better?
Actually, I can, there you go. There you go.
Perfect.
Okay, so these are some principles that we think should be kept in mind. We also think that it's a good crib sheet, I suppose, because each paragraph invites a detailed conversation about what you're doing. And we think this, everyone is going to have to make decisions about PPE, as Cynthia mentioned. The pre-testing, I think, is an issue that in the public domain, everybody knows about testing, even if they don't know that testing isn't always 100%. I think the notion of exclusions for people who are at risk in some way is also a conversation starter. any particular emphasis you'd like to put on any of these, Rob?
No, except that this particular version was, I prepared this when sharing it with one of our colleagues who is also an expert in viral transmission. So if this were going to be shared more broadly, I would loosen it up a little bit and explain some of the terms. But I think most people, I mean, PPE, everybody has heard that by now. So it's if you can get past the formality and a few of the acronyms, and it's I think pretty accessible.
I think that the one advantage this has is that it's in a sense, wherever you live, you can ask questions to your local officials or to your representatives about these things. You can ask them about the details of how particular communities are being treated or how accessible systems are to them. You can ask about how polling places are being cleaned, for example. You can ask about the availability of PPE and whether there's enough. You can ask if you're considering being a volunteer. You can ask what that entails in terms of testing, and you can make an informed decision about what you want to do.
Yeah. Now, as long as you have this displayed, I wanted to take this opportunity to ask Cynthia a question. In the rigorous sanitation protocols part, you'll see about halfway down, note also that while many sanitation procedures commonly applied during the pandemic have made little sense, and that an early emphasis on fomites presumed to persist on surfaces now seems to have been excessive, public expectations have developed. Confidence building measures in polling places thus should conform more closely to public expectations than clearest scientific insights may require. In other words, all these guys who spray things, that's really been overdone, and yet that has become iconic in the public mind. They associate that with safety, even though the amount of safety supplied is marginal. So I was concerned that if we said, look, do the things that we know make sense now, and don't waste your time on these other things, then voters might not be confident about what they were seeing. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I think that's true. You could, since resources are always finite, you could always have a rank ordered list, right? If you're trying to provide more specific guidance, and then indicate that, information about the kind of cleaning, right? I mean, because there is always the chance that people are going to be walking in and out and not see any cleaning being done, right? And still have questions. And I think people should have answers. So like if they ask somebody, like, how frequently are you cleaning, or to Jody's point about making sure everybody has their own pen, right? If that helps people be more confident, then I would say, yeah, I mean, in public health, self-efficacy, it's both a real, non-real thing, right? It's not a concrete, tangible thing, but it's an effect that we know really happens. So I would say if it increases people's confidence in the process, which is one of the things we're trying to do, I would just also be sure that if people are not going to see the level of cleaning they expect, the people on site have answers about what's being done and can respond and, provide those assurances.
Yeah, but this is not the time to educate the public about what does and doesn't work. It's the time to do something that will genuinely decrease risk, but also will genuinely increase a sense of confidence, I think.
Yeah, I think the message to election officials is if you're choosing among things, don't choose only that, right?
Yeah,
And not do the
yeah.
other things, because you may be choosing the thing. That's why I was saying that maybe a rank ordered list that provides some information about the return,
Mhm.
right? Or the cost benefit ratio of doing those things. But I agree with you. I don't think it should be eliminated entirely, because in general, people expect things to be cleaner now than before.
Yeah.
Anyone perhaps Paul, you can ask people who are at a computer rather than on their phone looking at this, whether this list has created any other questions in the last few minutes that we have here.
I have not seen any additional questions at this point, but maybe if people have some questions as follow-up, please feel free to share that. I think we can send out to everybody who registered. They should have registered with an email. We can send out both this document and if people have any questions.
Should say, as Rob indicated, this is a copy paste from a longer document which has an introduction that has the statement about our premise, our value being maximum informed participation in voting. So, there are different forms for this messaging as the audiences differ. But yeah, we think this is useful. We think it's clear, somewhat clear, and edits could no doubt make it clear, since this is better than it was 2 weeks ago. But the notion of having a principles-based approach to safe, full, and secure voting is I think, one that resonates with many people who are specialists in this area, and probably with the public, because it means telling people with all the clarity you can muster what you're doing to secure their access to the ballot with high integrity. So I'll shut this off now and give you back your.
There you go. You lost your audio.
I have?
Now you're back.
Okay. If I could ask panelists if they have any closing remarks they'd like to make about this issue, voting during COVID-19 and some of the issues that we talked about. Rob, start with you.
Well, I think I've said enough, but these are unusual times, and we don't even know when these times will end. In that sense, this is not necessarily the last election when we will be trying to solve this problem. Many people put very, very high degree of confidence in vaccines. Not a one of the vaccines in testing has presented any human efficacy data at all. And the more we get into this, the more impressive the role of the innate immune system becomes. And that's not the adaptive that produces antibodies. That's the first responder system that includes interferon. And you might recall that there are diseases that produce a lot of antibody that don't work. HIV, or don't work long, norovirus, right? So our obsessive focus on raising antibodies may not be the whole picture. Plus, if we have a vaccine approved that's 50% efficacious, or maybe, as Tony Fauci hopes, maybe 70 or 75, that means a quarter of the time it's not protective. And if people get vaccinated and then celebrate by going to a bar, it's not going to work. So this may be the first year since 1918 when we're dealing with this. It's very unlikely to be the last.
Jody, please.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Rob in the sense that this is the beginning of a new way of thinking about how to mitigate multiple public health threats. And, I'm thinking about just the potential threats to electoral engagement and the compounding effects, especially thinking about, historically marginalized communities who have long been subject to voter suppression efforts here in the United States. And like today, we're seeing COVID cases continue to rise, and the a picture of what a new post-pandemic normal looks like remains pretty cloudy. This election is going to be different from any other election in our history in ways that we do not yet know, but we do know that there are certain things that we can do, and I do hope that this conversation today and the subsequent conversations that we're having in multiple spaces, including these webinars, can hopefully provide some ideas, because we really need to get creative in some ways, but also use what we do know can work effectively in terms of making sure that we are providing access to engagement in our democratic system. So thanks for the opportunity for being here today.
Thank you, Jody, for participating. Cynthia, any closing thoughts?
Just encourage those of us who have, accurate, verifiable information to really up our game and communicate, up our volume, how much we communicate and how we communicate, and use as much plain language as possible. Even when you think you're communicating plainly, it's probably still not plain enough. So really think about how you would talk around your kitchen table, in line at the grocery store, standing at the soccer field. That's the kind of language we need to be using if we really want to reach the broadest segment of our society.
Thank you, Cynthia. And with that, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for a really informative discussion of some important issues. It remains to be seen exactly what will happen on November 3rd and immediately afterwards, but we can hope for the best, and we can try and inform as well as we can, following Cynthia's guidance, to sort of speak plainly, speak clearly, and with the best expertise that we have access to. Paul, back to you.
Let me start back up here. I just want to thank all of our panelists again, and for this really informative discussion, and the first of 3, as David mentioned. So if you didn't get a question that was asked today, please attend our next 2 sessions. Again, the next session would be on fair election processes, and what that will be mainly focused on ballots and cybersecurity and the integrity of ballots. And the final session 2 weeks from today will be focused more on combating efforts to disenfranchise people and ensuring that we can have full access to the ballot. And so stay tuned for further information on that. And we will also get this, the document that David shared, out to everybody who registered for the panel. And David, I don't know if you want to have some edits on that before we send it out, or what your preference would be for that. We'll make sure to send it out to everybody.
I think that Rob and I should probably take another look at it for clarity, and if Jody and Cynthia are willing to take a look at it for clarity for people, we would appreciate that too. So, but it would be very available very soon.
Great. With that, thank you everybody, and have a good rest of your afternoon.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.